guys, welcome back to the Astrology 101 lessons. If you are noticing a lisp, it's just because I have gotten Invisalign, which are basically an alternative to braces, and they make it kind of difficult for me to speak. But we will persevere and we will do the best we can because that is all we can do, okay? So today we're going to talk about the origins of astrology and its connections to Greek mythology. So I know a lot of people, anytime they hear about the association between astrology and mythology, they're like, oh, stop. You're just gonna further the assumption that astrology is all a myth and it's all made up. But I feel that if we all get a better understanding of the backstory, then we will all be on the same page. So astrology has its origins in ancient Babylon. And that is where priests used the movement of the planets to predict the desires or to know the desires of the gods. So judging by the outcome of the movement of the planets, that let them know whether the gods were favorable or whether the acts of the gods were unfavorable. So if you're catching my drift here, they were looking at the planets as divine entities. So they literally associated power with the planets. So they kind of looked at the planets as these godly beings that were kind of making things happen in the sky, as opposed to looking at astrology as sort of like economics, where you're simply looking at the patterns of the planets and just connecting those patterns to events. But nevertheless, whether they understood what they were doing or not, they looked at planets as godly beings who were able to control things like agriculture, fertility, love, war, the weather, you name it, the planets controlled it. As time progressed and as more people started to study astrology, people realized that, the planets are not magic. However, there are connections to the events that are happening and the patterns of the planets in the sky. So that's why I mentioned economics earlier. Economics is literally just the study of patterns. And that's all astrology is. It's the study of patterns. There is no divine intervention at all in it, which also debunks the myth, now that I can debunk the myth that people who study astrology are not religious or they don't have a relationship with God. Two completely different realms. Astrology is more of a science than it will ever be a religion. So now that we got that out the way, so how in the world did mythology come into play? Well, since they were looking at the planets as gods and they wanted to pass along this message that the planets were the things that were kind of making everything happen on Earth, they had to deliver this message to the masses to make it easily understandable. They associated different mythology to each of the planet to kind of describe what the planet was ruling and what types of events each planet could activate. Okay, so first let's talk about the god that is representative of the sun, which is Apollo. His father is Zeus. Everyone knows Zeus is the god of gods. We have more on him later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And then his mother was Leto, and she's the goddess of motherhood. So Apollo is always depicted as a strong, vibrant young man, which makes sense because in astrology, the sun is associated with vitality. Also important to note that his mother, Leto, goddess of motherhood, relates to the sun's natural house being the fifth house, because the fifth house rules fertility. I think that the intricacy of these stories behind these gods and goddesses are interesting because they kind of took the time to come up with who these gods and goddesses' parents were, which gives some insight into the primary roles and the secondary roles of these planets and luminaries. For example, with the sun, we see that Apollo, the sun god, he got some of the power of fertility from his mother, and then he got the vitality side of him from his father. But then so I would consider those secondary roles of the sun. But if we look at Apollo's job as a god, we see that his primary roles were pertaining to prophecy, the arts, healing, and music. So I think that the way that like the family structure of these gods is set up, it just lets us know, what the primary and secondary roles of each planet are. So the goddess who represents the moon is Diana, also known as Artemis. So let me explain. She is known as Diana in Roman mythology, and she is known as Artemis in Greek mythology. But in any case, she is the sister of Apollo, the sun god who we just talked about, and she rules over hunting, childbirth, and animals. So moving on to Mercury, the god representing Mercury's title is actually Mercury. He was the son of Jupiter. Jupiter is the god of the earth and the heavens. We'll talk a little bit more about Jupiter later. But Mercury, also known as the messenger god, ruled over commerce and travel, and of course, messaging. So that one was pretty obvious. I do want to touch on the commerce portion of this though. I think that it's interesting that Mercury, or the messenger god, ruled over commerce, because it's something that is not commonly talked about when talking about Mercury in astrology, because as we know, commerce is the buying and selling of goods. So for example, I remember reading something, it was regarding basically things to do during a Mercury retrograde, and basically it was saying that sometimes releasing products, like for selling, is a good thing to do during a Mercury retrograde, especially with technology products, because the goal is to get people to re-buy your product. And as we know, as we talked about before, things that are done during a Mercury retrograde more than likely need to be redone. So for example, take Apple, a company who is always re-releasing products and making a little itty bitty updates and then releasing it as like iPhone 10, iPhone 11, iPhone 12. So they want people to keep rebuying essentially the same product. So I would not be surprised to learn that Apple might aim to release during Mercury retrogrades. So how about I make that an assignment? Let's look that up after this lesson to look up Apple release dates and then see if they line up with Mercury retrogrades, or to see if we can find a pattern there. Venus, represented by the goddess of love, rules over fertility, beauty, and gardens, and she is actually sister to Saturn, which we'll talk about later. Mars was the god of war, of course. So now we are circling back to Jupiter. Okay, so let me just give you some background on Jupiter and Zeus. So as I said, Jupiter is the god of earth and the heavens, and then Zeus is known as god of gods. So Zeus is associated with Greek mythology, Jupiter is associated with Roman mythology. Zeus was self-appointed and Jupiter was not. And mythology says that the only reason that Zeus was god of gods was because he was just too powerful and no one dared to try to take his seat. Jupiter's backstory is a little less aggressive. So basically, when Jupiter's father, Saturn, died, he appointed Jupiter and his two brothers, Neptune and Pluto, to divide the world up evenly and then rule those portions how they see fit. Jupiter took the heavens, Neptune took the sea, and Pluto took the underworld. And Saturn also represents the legacy that you leave behind. So it's just all coming together, ain't it? But in a more practical sense, Saturn was the god of agriculture. I find that kind of interesting because with agriculture, it's basically about putting in work and not being able to reap what you sow for, a long period of time. So you're having to harvest, put in all this work to harvest to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor later on. And that is exactly what Saturn wants us to do. It wants us to put in the work very hard, and a lot of things that are activated by Saturn take time to achieve. So let's move on to Uranus, who is the father of Saturn. Whoa. So Uranus's backstory is kind of crazy. So Saturn actually castrated Uranus, and when Uranus's genitals fell to the ground, they birthed Venus. And honestly, I feel like they made that backstory the most Uranus backstory they ever could. Like, what the heck? What did they gain from that? You know, like, unprovoked, you come up with a story like that. But as I thought of it, I was like, okay, so I think that that kind of embodies the chaotic nature of Uranus. I always, when I'm talking about Uranus transits to people, like about their chart, I always tell them to just prepare, because when Uranus is transiting a major house in your chart, good things are gonna happen and bad things are gonna happen. Uranus isn't really associated with good or bad. It's associated with the unexpected, the unpredictable. And that story, that backstory is so unpredictable. Like you would never guess that chain of events. But I think that it's something that Uranus is the father to both Saturn and Venus. Saturn, that is a historically malefic planet, and then Venus, that is a historically benefic planet. So it just kind of shows that, you know, you never know what you're gonna get with Uranus, so just have all your ducks in a row when it comes. So Neptune, as most of us know, is god of the sea. And there's not much to say about him. You know, he's ruling large bodies of water. He's doing what he does. But I kind of wanted to touch on the fact that Neptune is currently in Pisces, and it's been in Pisces since 2012, and it will be in Pisces until 2025. And I want to talk about the other things besides large bodies of water that Neptune rules, and then also the fact that Neptune is at home in Pisces. So Neptune is Pisces' natural ruler. With the outer planets, so Neptune, Pluto, Uranus, their effects are going to be more on a global scale than affecting you individually. If you want to see how they affect you individually, look at the aspects that it's making in your chart and, you know, how it's transiting in your chart. But I find this interesting because Neptune rules hospitals, it rules drugs, it rules prisons, it rules mental institutions. And so with it ruling those things and then being at home in Pisces, I either see a reformation of these things or some sort of ending of these things, because it's home, the 12th house, it rules endings. So I just think it's gonna be interesting to see how this all plays out. We see now how states are kind of changing their laws with weed, or marijuana rather, when it comes to prison reform. We're fighting to get those who are incarcerated due to drug charges, or more specifically marijuana charges, out of prison. And then those who are addicted to drugs, you know, we're fighting for them to get the help they need as opposed to simply locking them up. Defund the police, I feel, ties into this. So at its best, Neptune is a healer. At its worst, Neptune is a kind of a deceiver, because it kind of blinds us, or it kind of puts rose-colored glasses on us so that we're not seeing what's real, which is why Neptune also rules photography and celebrities and the film industry. So just looking at world events from 2012 to 2025 is interesting. Considering the type of energy that we've been receiving from Neptune. Pluto, also another well-known god, is god of the underworld. in Roman mythology. In Greek mythology, he's known as Hades, also god of the underworld. That was mythology's crazy way of interpreting death and rebirth. But Pluto also ruled over wealth, and that is because you find jewels and diamonds underground by mining, which is interesting because Pluto's natural home ended up being the 8th house, which we know now rules other people's resources, and it rules inheritance. And the tie to inheritance and death and rebirth is just so obvious, but also so morbid. So it makes sense for them to kind of make Pluto god of the underworld. But I think it shows the two sides of Pluto. Pluto is going to be powerful either way, whether the power is used for good or it's used for bad, which is why I always associate Pluto with power and permanence, because if you look at death and rebirth, those are two things that are permanent, right? If something is birthed, you can't unbirth it. It can pass away, but that's death, which is also permanent. So I think they were just trying to say that Pluto represents power, but they were just being really dramatic about it. So we have gone over all the gods, well, not nearly all of the Greek and Roman gods, but all of the gods that were representative of planets, and so that we get a better understanding of why mythology was created in the first place, okay? So I hope I cleared some things up for people today, and I hope I gave you some fun things to research. Go down a Greek mythology rabbit hole, have fun, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.